Good day. Here we are, Module 1 of our Wisconsin Collective for Comprehensive Assessment pilot project, focusing on Criterion reference assessment. If you haven't done so already, please watch the 7-minute video giving the overview of the project. Let's go ahead and get started. So what we're hoping to do today is define what is a Criterion reference assessment. I think, there's a lot of confusion in the literature from us as practitioners, from myself, of what exactly are these Criterion reference assessments? How does this relate to like those informal assessments? And we'll work through some of those issues. I always think it's helpful to do case-based learning. So then we're going to provide some different examples of using Criterion reference assessments, show how they add value, both with identification and determining eligibility, as well as documenting the educational impact in developing educationally relevant IEPs. And then at the end, we'll give you a few food for thought items for you to plan for that coaching session. I'm going to turn my camera off so I don't get my head doesn't get in the way with the future content, and we'll proceed. As we all know, there was a rule change that was started in August of 2021 that revised the way that we approach our assessment practice. Now, with this rule change, Criterion reference assessments are much more prominent. It's one of the options that's available for doing assessments for language impairment as well as speech sound production and articulation. The prominence of Criterion reference assessments is consistent with the spirit of the comprehensive assessment approach. Where we don't rely on any single measure, we don't rely on any single tool, rather look at the converging evidence from multiple tools to determine if there is a disability and to create that educationally relevant IEP. We can see this spirit in the different rubrics that DPI provided that coincide with this rule change, really looking at how we can interpret these multiple sources of data. Now, I think this gets a little jargony. There's lots of different terminology. What does this all mean? Criterion reference, norm reference, language sample, and we also have been taught things about informal assessments, authentic assessments. What does this all? A nice place to start is with norm reference tests. These have always been in our wheelhouse and things we are very familiar with. So with norm reference tests, they tend to be highly standardized. Every student gets the same materials. Every student is asked the same question, given the same prompt. By being highly standardized, we often look at small parts of language. This is the easiest way to get a test to be standardized. Look at how students produce morphemes or comprehend individual sentences or identify synonyms. Then, by having all of these students completing the same tasks, looking at the same language features, we can compare our student to the normative sample and get some sort of score. That's the heart of our norm reference tests, is getting that normative data. So when we think about all other non-norm reference tests, I think one word that often comes to mind is informal. Are we just doing informal assessments if we're not giving a standardized norm reference test? I've always had some trouble with this word. To me, it kind of sounds like, I'm going to lay on the couch and just kind of see what happens and see what I see and see where this goes. That's not what we're talking about with Criterion reference assessments. They're not simply informal assessments. They're tests that measure an individual's performance against a set of predetermined criteria, right? Or looking at how they perform relative to performance standards. So that's how ASHA defines Criterion reference assessments. So just as norm reference assessments compare performance to a normative set of data, Criterion reference assessments compare performance to some sort of pre-established criterion. And when we think of this specific to educational settings, we can use these Criterion reference assessments to determine if our students have learned a certain body of knowledge, if they've learned and acquired certain skills that are in the curriculum. And so we're not looking, are you in the 50th or 90th or 5th percentile of doing this assignment or meeting this standard. Rather, we're looking and trying to determine, have you met the standard or have you not met the standard? Have you met the criterion, the expectations, or have you not met that? So I think when we think in this frame, we can lose that term informal and really see, okay, this is actually more formal. This has some structure. We're not just winging it. We're trying to determine if our students have met certain criteria, if they've met a criterion with a standard or some other type of predetermined criteria. So let's just give some examples of what these criterion reference assessments might look like. I'm going to put one brief Madison-specific caveat in here. I know that you have tests that are vetted. So this is not an endorsement for any of these tests. I'm just trying to give some examples of what criterion reference assessments are. Some you might be familiar with, and how we're looking at whether or not someone meets the criteria. So a skill we could be interested in is talking about your friends, right? So are you able to have discussions and talk about your friends? Use that language to talk about things that are not in the here and now. A certain criterion we might look at is, can you name 2 friends and talk about 2 friends by 48 months of age? Where did I get that criterion from? This is from the ASQ, the Ages and Stages Questionnaire. We could also look at your ability to use school vocabulary, right? So are you using vocabulary that's appropriate for the classroom and the curriculum that that the student is studying? And students, by 3rd grade should be using most of the school vocabulary regularly. There's different ways we can assess this. And this is an item from the student language scale. So we're not determining if the student's in the 90th percentile of using vocabulary or the 6th percentile. We're just saying, are you using vocabulary, school-based academic vocabulary to a level that we would expect, and have you met that? Another item could be asking questions in order to seek help, get information, or clarify something that's not understood. This is a skill that we're interested in. And a criterion we might have is by the end of kindergarten, you're able to do these things. And where do we get this from? Where do we get that information from? This particular example comes from the academic standards. So again, not looking to see if you're in the 5th percentile of asking questions, but are you able to get by in your day-to-day interactions? Are you meeting those criteria? Another one could be describing how a robotic arm works and how you overcame obstacles. And this is one that I thought of when I was putting this together, because this is something my daughter just had to do for her robotics class. So high school students with requisite experience should be able to use expository discourse. They should be able to describe processes. And the source that I have for this is a very informal source. Talking with the teacher, I can see if she meets that expectation. Look at the rubric, see how she did at the language to describe how she overcame the obstacles. So just a few examples here for you. So how do we use these criterion reference assessments? I'm going to show you some examples, and when we go through these examples, we want to determine, is there a significant discrepancy? That's one of the tasks we need to accomplish when doing our comprehensive assessments, is determining if our student is significantly behind their peers. And if so, is the difficulty that they're having, is it having an impact on their education? Is it interfering with our students' ability to meet the expectations of the classroom and of the school? Let's start with the case of Peter. So Peter is in 2nd grade and has language concerns. Administering the SELF 5, we see a standard score of 72. Again, this is not an endorsement for the SELF, but just giving you an example. This looks to be a pretty significant discrepancy from his peers, well beyond the cutoff score in the SELF manual. We also administered the PPVT, and here we see a standard score, a bit of a discrepancy between the SELF and the Peabody, and see a standard score of 87. Looking at Peter's STAR reading growth report, we see that his achievement is below grade level expectations. And really looking within the STAR, we see that he's having difficulty in vocabulary and comprehension. And then finally, there's a classroom rubric that his teacher uses for story composition. And at the end of the semester, we see on the 5-point scale, he is at the floor. So it's at the not satisfactory level of performance. Most students in his class are at that the 4 or 5 level, proficient to exceptional. He is not meeting that criterion. Okay, so our first question within our assessment, is there a discrepancy? Is he significantly behind his peers? And with the self data, I'd say yes, I'm pretty confident that I got good data from Peter and that was that significant discrepancy. The Peabody was a bit of a red herring here for you. So the Peabody is just a bad choice of a test. If you look in the manual, you will see it was not developed to help with identification of children with language disorders. So I really would not recommend giving that assessment, and I would not have that guide my interpretation of Peter's case. The STAR testing, I also see here that, yes, there is that significant discrepancy. He is not meeting that expectation. He's not meeting that criterion. And I'm somewhat confident of it. You know, it's not a language test. It's not looking at some of those key diagnostic markers in depth, but we see that he's not meeting some academic expectations in the area of language. So yeah, I think that's providing corroborating, collaborating, converging evidence that there is a disorder. The rubric as well, you know, yeah, his teacher may, you know, have somewhat inaccurately coded it. We don't have great reliability and validity data on it, but we can pretty clearly see in this language area that's highly related to the curriculum that he is well behind his peers. So now if we want to look at that educational impact, how do we interpret these data? Well, with something like the self, it takes a leap of faith, right? So if the self is showing that he's having difficulty with certain inflectional morphemes following multi-step directions, I have to assume that those difficulties are showing up in the classroom, right? We're not looking at anything functional. We're not looking at any particular educational tasks. So I have to kind of make the assumption, make that leap of faith that these difficulties are going to show up in different aspects of the curriculum. However, with my criterion reference assessments, I have much clearer documentation of the impact of his language difficulties. The STAR is looking directly at academic skills. That rubric is really looking at what he's expected to do in the classroom. So for developing meaningful goals, the self, I give an LOL. So these norm reference tests, they're not designed to generate meaningful, functional, educationally relevant goals. We're not going to improve a student's educational aspirations by having them point to series of dots and circles. I really like something like the STAR and that story rubric because it opens conversations with the teacher. It provides excellent collaborative opportunities. Okay, so like I said, there is the caveat here that I know that you need to use vetted assessment instruments within MMSD. I'm just trying to illustrate kind of from a more theoretical approach of how these different types of assessments can contribute to different parts of our assessment process. Okay, so what do we gain from those criterion reference assessments? I think it really helped us to identify that disorder. It really makes me feel more confident in determining the eligibility. We're getting good verification of our norm reference data. We're really showing that educational impact. And by showing that educational impact, we're able to develop more meaningful goals. I think it's much more meaningful to work on a curriculum-based tasks like stories and story rubrics rather than discrete skills like following multi-step directions, not in context. I also think that these criterion reference assessments, they can be administered multiple times, and we can really monitor progress and see if our interventions are allowing our students to better access the curriculum. Now that we've seen that example with Peter, let's take a step back and think a little bit about these criterion reference assessments and educational impact. In general, when we think about criterion reference assessments, we tend to be looking more at functional and educational tasks. The examples I gave so far, a story rubric, the stars, it's looking more at educational tasks. The example that we're going to present later this semester, the student language scale, it's going to be working with teachers to see how are they communicating within the classroom, different aspects of the educational environment. So not looking at discrete skills, but rather looking at performance on functional educational tasks. And we also typically see how kids and our students communicate in everyday situations. How are they using their language and speech skills in order to get their needs met and communicate effectively and get by in their day-to-day lives? Another consideration with any of our assessments are the cultural and linguistic implications. We know that norm reference tests are often biased against speakers from non-mainstream backgrounds. Most of the assumptions with most of our tests are that the students will be monolingual speakers who speak a mainstream dialect. There's also an assumption that all students have a lot of familiarity with the types of tasks they're supposed to be completing. Criterion reference assessments, no assessment's perfect, but it does overcome some of these biases. So criterion reference assessments, they tend to be more naturalistic, right? And they tend to be something that students have had more experience with. Also, we tend to look at overall communication effectiveness rather than individual discrete skills, individual pieces of knowledge that we see on norm reference tests. Also, our criterion reference assessments, they tend to be easier to adapt to different languages and different dialects. So we have a few more cases for you to look through just to show this application. Let's take the case of Amy. Amy got a standard score of 79 on the CAP2. She has a few articulation errors, minor phonological processes. The DIBELS is a literacy test, emergent literacy and literacy formative assessment. And we see that her score is 339, which is above the criteria for strategic supports and intensive supports. So she has met the criterion for the DIBELS on her composite score. She's meeting expectations. Looking at our classroom writing sample, we see some spelling errors, but those errors are not phonological in nature. And we see after talking to Amy's teacher that most of those spelling errors that she's showing are very consistent with what the other students are doing. So we have our norm reference test that shows she's kind of in this borderline area, that does have some articulation, phonological difficulties. Our criterion reference assessments here, looking at her reading and her writing skills, show that she is meeting those expectations. Right, so if these are more articulation errors, we may then want to go and look at stimulability. Looking at the overall picture, there doesn't seem to be a large educational impact here. Amy doesn't seem to be having difficulty accessing the curriculum. So from this pattern of results, I could be convinced that Amy would not be eligible for services if we are not seeing a big significant discrepancy, seeing some stimulability if it's an articulation case, not seeing that educational impact. Let's take Amy's twin sister, Allie. Allie got a lower standard score on the CAP2, multiple phonological processes. Here we're seeing a DIBELS composite score of 312, below that criterion of 320, where she would be suggested to have intensive supports. We see in the classroom writing sample that there are spelling errors that go along with those phonological errors that she's showing, or those phonological processes. Here we see a striking discrepancy, significant discrepancy, where she's having significant difficulty and multiple phonological processes, we also see that it's having an educational impact. She's not meeting the expectations. She's not meeting those criteria for reading and writing. And the root cause, at least in part, is likely her phonological disorder. The last case I have for us here is Daniel. Daniel's in 3rd grade. Daniel's bilingual and speaks English and Spanish. Administering the English and Spanish, we see his scores are a bit low, 72, 78. The 72 is certainly a significant discrepancy. The Spanish standard score 78. It exceeds the recommended cut score, and you could argue that's a significant discrepancy as well. Now, looking at his educational performance, we see that he's in the 1st percentile on that STAR reading growth. He's not meeting the expectations, not meeting the criteria for his grade. Another assessment we could give is the Cubed. The Cubed is a Criterion reference assessment. It's freely available. It has a subtest called the narrative language measure that looks at listening and retell of a story. And we see that Daniel's retell score was 14, and 18 to 27 is considered moderate risk, 17 and below is considered high risk. So if we're thinking, of those as the criteria, he is not meeting those criteria. It's also important to note that with the Cube, those criteria were developed with bilingual students, and looking at his performance, see that he really struggled including those different story grammar elements in the key vocabulary. Within reading, he did have a relative strength in decoding, but he really continued to struggle with those language aspects, including story grammar, language complexity, and vocabulary. So here, we see that there is that significant discrepancy. We see that those results have a converging evidence with the Criterion reference assessments. We see that it's having an impact on aspects related to the curriculum. So the final food for thought, what I'd like you to think about before your coaching session with Alyssa is to think about a student on your caseload you'd like to focus on in the coming weeks. This could be a student you're thinking about dismissing, a student where maybe you want to do some exploration of the educational impact of the disorder, or just, simply a student whose teacher you like to work with. So as you prepare for your coaching session, we'd like you to just think about, you don't have to write anything formally, just think about some background information you can share about your student with Alyssa, what you'd like to learn, what do you hope to get out of the coming weeks? What do you hope to learn about Criterion reference assessments? Like, would you want to think about how these come into reevals and determining if a student's eligible for discharge? Would you like to learn just more broadly about how to document educational impact and how these tools can be useful? Are there certain aspects of the curriculum you'd like to learn about through this process? Are there certain things that you want to learn from the teacher? Are there certain things that you just want to get to know more about your student? And then just in general, what questions do you have about Criterion reference assessments? So go ahead and schedule that appointment with Alyssa. All the directions are in that email. Any other questions, comments, suggestions, feel free to reach out to Alyssa or I. I really look forward to working with you in these coming weeks, and I will talk to you soon.